Hi everyone, this is Nancy Farlow again. This week we're going to talk a little bit about the history of green marketing in the United States. This is just an overview, and actually I'm going to focus on product labeling, which predominantly was all there was to green marketing in the beginning. Later on, when we talk about labeling, we'll talk about some of these eco labels a little bit more and some of the product claims, but just to give you an overview of how environmental marketing has been perceived in the U.S. and how it has played out, this will just touch on some of the basics. So basically in around the 60s, there became an interest in environmental issues in the U.S., primarily because of the book Silent Spring, which was written by Rachel Carson. And this book was the first book that actually made the connection between, in this case it was DDT, the insecticide, and the effect it was having on birds and also on human beings as a result. And the title Silent Spring was the die-off of the songbirds that was resulting from the use of these insecticides. The first Earth Day resulted from this interest in environmental issues, and that was in 1970. A lot of people think that Earth Day actually began in the 90s, but that's not true. The first environmental movement in the U.S. was actually in the late 60s, early 70s. However, this interest in the environment sort of died off in the 80s when we had a decade of excess. It's when Wall Street really took off. There was a lot of money floating around. People were more interested in having a good time than they were in the environment. This is when we saw growth in cocaine and usage and sports cars, and more consumerism in general actually grew in the 80s. But in the 90s, we began to see a renewed interest in environmental issues, and also with this interest came an interest in environmental products and how as consumers we could be more environmentally conscious, and the marketplace responded to consumers' interest in environmental products. Unfortunately, not all of the products were that truly environmental. One of the major cases that resulted in a change was what's known as the Hefty Bag case. And this was Mobil Oil produced Hefty bags, and they began to package on the Hefty Bag box itself saying that the bags were biodegradable. And the content of the bag, the way they were made, it actually was biodegradable, but because garbage bags end up in landfills and are not subject to sunlight, the actual process of being biodegradable was not really accurate, because once the bags were in the landfill, they were not being subjected to sunlight, so they were not breaking down. And this lawsuit went on for a number of years. It was brought by the FTC, which is the Federal Trade Commission, and it oversees most of the advertising laws in the U.S. So initially, these green claims were overseen by the FTC rather than the Environmental Protection Agency, which is what most people would have thought. But because these were advertising claims, they actually fell into the jurisdiction of the FTC. There was a rift between the EPA and the FTC, and I'll spare you from all of that, but it went back and forth over who should have control over marketing claims. And as the interest in using environmental marketing claims grew, the number of products grew. As this slide demonstrates, just in 5 years, the number of products that were labeled as being green rose from 60 to over 800 on shelves for consumers. Nearly 10% of all the new products that were introduced in 1990 were actually identified as being environmentally sound, even though there had never been a definition of what environmentally sound actually meant. But marketers began to just throw terms around like green, earth-friendly, ozone-friendly, protecting the earth, these sorts of things. They just slapped on packages and on products without having any substantiation behind their claims. And there was concern over this primarily by environmental groups who went to the FTC and expressed their concerns, and to the EPA and expressed their concerns about this misuse of claims, because they're afraid that as consumers began to realize that these claims were not accurate, that they would be less motivated to buy from companies who really were producing legitimate green products. The company Seventh Generation actually came about in this time frame, and was one of the first pioneers in producing truly green products, but because all of the other manufacturers were producing products and slapping the label green on it, the company Seventh Generation was sort of lost in the shuffle, and so people became skeptical of all claims that products were environmentally friendly. We're going to talk about labeling a little bit more, but I just wanted to give you an idea of some of the claims that were made that have been deemed as being misleading and vague. For example, against animal testing. Well, that doesn't really say anything. This is actually a product from The Body Shop, which is another company that grew as a result of this interest in environmental products. And they're legitimate products, but because there hasn't been any regulation, or at that time there wasn't any regulation, they could just pretty much say whatever they want on the bottles. Today there is regulation. For example, this one also, no animal testing. That doesn't really mean anything unless you have someone behind you who's verifying whether or not there was animal testing. And as a result of that, there have been organizations established who do verify, and these are called third-party certifiers that place these labels. And we'll talk about that some more. This is another example. Safe for septic tanks. Contains no phosphate. Well, phosphate's been illegal for many years. This is a 2001 product, and phosphates have been illegal since the 70s. So it sounds like as if it's really great, but they're just following federal guidelines. Recyclable if a program exists in your area. At this time in the early 2000s, there was not really the municipal recyclable programs that you see today. Some other misleading claims. This whole eco-info. This was on a bottle of, let me see if I can remember. I think it was wax, household wax, furniture wax, or something like that. And this whole label is very misleading. No CFCs. Again, CFCs have not been allowed in the U.S. since the 70s, since they were determined to actually reduce the ozone. So that's really misleading, makes it sound as though they're better than other products, when in fact no product could contain CFCs. And that's the same with this other product, which is a bottle of Lysol. This is a little bit more of what we see today, where it actually claims how much of the product container, in this case a spray bottle or can, is actually from recycled steel, which is post-consumer, meaning that it's material that has been returned from consumers. It was in one form at one time, versus recycled material that is discarded during the manufacturing process, and so it's never actually formed into a bottle, for example. So as a result of these concerns of the misleading claims, the Federal Trade Commission, after a number of years of fighting between EPA and FTC, developed these guides for the use of environmental marketing claims. And they first introduced them in 1992, then they were revised in 1996, and again in 1998, and then just recently they were revised again because of the renewed interest in environmental claims and the new interest in green marketing that we've seen in the last 5 or 6 years. The issue with these FTC guidelines is that they're not enforceable. They are really suggestions. The FTC is not a patrolling organization. They will not go after companies unless a complaint is actually issued. They're an underfunded organization, they're an understaffed organization, and they just don't have time to sit around and look for these unscrupulous claims. They have to wait until a complaint has been issued, and then they'll investigate. Usually, they will issue, once they find that a claim is, and this is in all advertising, if they find a claim is misleading, they will issue a letter to the advertiser asking them to pull the advertisements, and if they don't, then they will eventually go to a lawsuit, which can be very expensive both for the government as well as for the company. So as a result of these FTC guidelines, from when they were initially established, the FTC only challenged 37 vague claims in 10 years. The states were not happy with this. They thought more should have been done to protect consumers, and so actually a number of states, 34, actually introduced their own stricter standards. The EPA was not happy with what the FTC was doing either, so they developed their own programs, such as the Energy Star. USDA now has their own label, also the organic symbol. And again, we'll talk about labeling a little bit later on.